Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Falco, and I'm going to take you through our section 2, which is the attack methodology. And the attack methodology is very important because, first, if you don't know how to break it, you really don't know how to fix it. And also, when it comes to attack methodology, there's actually quite a bit of thinking that's involved in breaking into a system. And so we want to help you understand what the different threats are to your system, those different attack vectors, and also, the thought process that a hacker would go through in order to think about how they might break into your system. So with that, let's start with looking at some of the high-level threats against satellite systems. Before I jump into this, I just want to mention that many of these threats that you'll see are akin to others that you'd find for any type of cyber-physical system. And the reason why this is important to note is because you may not think that there's a lot of people out there who have the interest or capabilities of breaking into a satellite system. However, these threats are very similar to others that are not based in space. And with that said, they're going to be able to possibly take their skill set and apply it right here. So again, satellites, they are special in some ways, but in many cases, in terms of the different threats to them, they're very similar to other types of systems. The different threats that you'll see in red are ones that we're going to demo for you as part of different scenarios. So just keep that in mind. So the first one we want to talk about is unauthorized control. And this is exactly as it sounds, where you have a bad actor getting control over your satellite when they're not supposed to get control over it. Usually it's done through stealing someone's credentials, but it can also be done through finding an exploit to be able to access the control system and mess around. Obviously not something you want as a satellite operator or a developer. The other type of threat is the corruption or modification of systems or its data. And so because satellites are generally finely tuned systems, you don't want any type of modifications going on, right? Any type of sensitive change any change will be sensitive to the device. And that's not something that you want happening with something that's so far away and you aren't able to actually go maintain it as frequently as you would something that you can walk up to. And so this often you might think about this more as like tampering with configurations or different sensing capabilities of the satellite. So there's just kind of like tweaking things in the wrong way. That's what we're meaning here by corruption and modification of system data. Interception of data. This one is something where you have data going back and forth to a satellite system, and the interception is where you have a man in the middle, someone who's listening in on those communications. Sometimes that those communications are encrypted, so they won't be able to actually determine necessarily what those communications say, but nevertheless, sometimes it's not. And you don't want someone listening in on those communications. Sometimes that listening in can be a little bit more than listening in. Sometimes it means that they're listening and then they're not allowing the correct information to flow through to you, or they're blocking the information from flowing through to you. But that's interception of data in combination with several other threats that we're going to be talking about. For one example is jamming, which is the next one, where they're blocking the communications, right? They're jamming the RF communications to and from, or generally from the satellite to you down to the ground station. This is something that we've heard a lot about in the news over the past couple of years, especially relating to GPS signals. Denial of service is a threat that's apparent with any kind of digital system where you have a bad actor that floods the controls, and they're basically sending a whole bunch of commands to the device, and the device can't handle it. And so it usually causes issues in terms of timing, in terms of being able to execute those commands, or just kind of breaking the system because it can't handle all of the traffic coming by it. Another type of threat is masquerading. Masquerading is really just the illegitimate posing of the authorized entity. Sometimes this can take the form of a bad actor just walking into a satellite operator ground station control and just doing stuff with the satellite, which obviously hopefully wouldn't happen, but it could. It can also mean that they're masking IP addresses and MAC addresses of the ground station and being able to figure out how to pretend that they are a legitimate actor even though they're not. A replay attack is where you may have a bad actor record a series of typical operations of a satellite and then replay that back to the operator. So the operator doesn't know something bad is happening, but then in the background, the bad actor is actually, doing some nasty things with your satellite. The most famous example of this, not with the satellite, but with another cyber physical system, is with Stuxnet, where the attackers took recording of normal activity of the centrifuges, the Iranian centrifuges, and kept playing that back to the operator. So the operator was none the wiser, while the attacker was destroying the centrifuge system. And so another type of threat is a software threat. This is your basic misconfigurations or programming errors, planting vulnerabilities in the system. Maybe sometimes even just bugs if it's unintentional, but we're really thinking about threats, so usually it's not unintentional. But that's kind of what we're meaning by software threats. And another type of threat is the supply chain. And as I mentioned earlier, satellites are complex. There's a whole bunch of pieces to that puzzle. And because of that, there's a whole bunch of different parties that may touch that system before it gets launched and goes into orbit. And so, you may have an attacker plant something on that real estate on that satellite. It's a very expensive real estate, so it's very desirable to be able to kind of put something that's unauthorized on a PCB, on a circuit board, or plant some malicious firmware into that device because the operator may be none the wiser. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about the different ways of thinking through the process that an attacker would go through while they're planning their attack and then executing their attack. And the way we do this is called developing an attack tree. Now, attack trees are a derivation of something called fault trees, which were originally kind of introduced and used heavily in the 1970s for the aerospace and aeronautics community, particularly relating to ICBMs. And so those fault trees were where a risk manager or an operator would kind of conceive a fault that would occur, and then they would try and back into all of the different ways that faults can actually materialize. And so in the late 1990s, attack trees were developed, which, as I said, is kind of a derivation on a fault tree, where the top of the attack tree, instead of being a fault that may occur, is the goal of an attacker. And so when you have an attack tree, you start with that goal. So maybe when it comes to your satellite, maybe it's bricking the satellite system, right? You want the satellite to not operate anymore. And so that's your goal. And that would be kind of put right here at the top of your tree. And then you would kind of ask yourself consistently, well, how would you achieve that goal? And you'd have a series of sub goals. And then you keep asking yourself, well, how does that happen? And how do you do that? And how do you do that? And that's kind of how you build out this tree structure with branches and leaf nodes is what we call them. Kind of just asking yourself, like, how do I do this? And sometimes, these steps that are taken are multiple that have to occur in order to achieve that sub goal, requiring what we call an and statement, or it's an or statement, meaning that one thing has to occur or the other thing has to occur to achieve that sub goal. So these are all kind of methods to think through how a hacker would go about it. I'm going to take you a little deeper. And so going about an attack tree could be a bit daunting because there's so many possibilities for how an attacker could break into your system. And so what we did between Arun, myself, and some colleagues is we developed a mechanism to kind of dive deep into a structured way of getting into that hacker mindset. We call it a master attack methodology, and where we kind of help users of attack trees think about, okay, well, when in the process of an attack does something occur? Where on the surface area of that device is that attack happening? What exactly is happening? And how are you achieving that action? And so these are the different kind of layers of the levels of the attack tree I had just shown you, those different levels of that tree structure. You want to go about asking yourself those questions for each of these layers. And there are different frameworks that can be leveraged to kind of help you answer those questions. And so I'll take you through that briefly now, but also, as we go about our demos later, you're going to see some of this play out, and you'll see actually the attack trees that had been built out for those demo scenarios. So just to give you another layer of granularity here, again, let's say your goal is to brick the system, right? And so that would be here. And then when we talk about like when in the attack process, Lockheed Martin came up with something called the cyber kill chain a number of years ago. And what it talks to is how, an attack is not just a one-stop, shop. It's not a one-time event. There's a whole bunch of different actions that lead up to the hack occurring. And not always are all of these actions something that happens, but they all could be included in any given attack. And so what we are proposing to do when you build out an attack tree is think through each of these steps. And the steps may be reconnaissance, where you're looking around and trying to gather information about that target system, maybe that target satellite system. Weaponization, where you're trying to think about, how do you prepare that weapon that you're going to be ultimately sending to that device? Then you're going to deliver it. How do you actually deliver it to that system? Then after you get that weapon somewhere to that system, how do you get in, right? What is the exploit? And after you actually get in, how do you go control that system? How do you manage it? And then we want you to think about, how do you achieve that primary objective after you have access and are managing that system? What are you going to do? And finally, are you going to maintain your presence there? Is there going to be persistence? And so these are the different kind of phases of an attack. And this is usually for very complex attacks, you have all of these different phases. However, again, you don't always have to go through all of these pieces of the puzzle. And so this is kind of the first layer of the attack tree that we usually propose. After that, after you kind of enumerate out each of these different steps, you want to ask yourself, okay, well, where do you attack? Where exactly is the reconnaissance occurring on? So for example, is there a web interface of the satellite that you're gathering information about? And then you want to ask yourselves the question of, what is the action? What are you actually doing? And so if you're doing reconnaissance and you are looking at the web interface of the satellite, you're probably wanting to collect some information, right? You want to collect information about the location of that satellite so that you're able to actually start targeting it. And so that's maybe one of the actions that you'd take under reconnaissance. And then finally, you want to think about, like, how do you actually achieve that? What kind of tools are you using? And for reconnaissance, a good typical tool is Nmap, which is a network mapping tool. And you'll be able to kind of understand a lot of different pieces of how that system is interacting across its own network. And so you want to go through this process for each of these different components where applicable. So again, for weaponization, if you are trying to brick that satellite, if you're trying to create a weapon in order to brick that satellite, how do you prepare the weapon? Where do you prepare the weapon on? So in that case, this might not be relevant here, right? Maybe it's such that you're not actually preparing a weapon on any attack surface. But the action is certainly to develop that weapon, right? So there's relevance for this section. And then, there are tools to develop that given weapon, maybe using different components of Kali Linux, which is a penetration testing operating system. And we continue our way through each of these steps in this way. Again, delivering whatever that weapon is to a given attack surface. So if you created a weapon and some kind of mechanism to brick that satellite, is it going to be are you going to be delivering it to the web interface? Are you going to be delivering it to the user? Are you going to be delivering it to the administrative panel? Ask yourself these questions. And by going through this process, this is essentially what an attacker is going through. Now, with that said, attackers aren't going to build out this attack tree for their attack, but this is what's kind of going on in their mind subconsciously. And by you being able to go through each of these steps and thinking about this in a very methodical way, you'll be able to kind of capture their thought process and be defensive in the right way about how you're going to protect your system. So with that said, let's move on to the next part of our section.